And so we begin with Chapter 8, and Chapter 8 focuses on photosynthesis. But for this first section here, we're going to kind of go back a little bit and explain kind of the reaction side of things and the purpose of photosynthesis before we really get into the nitty-gritty behind it. All right, so I'm going to have you remember way back when of the different characteristics of life. And sorry, these little ends, I don't know, something with my formatting, they're supposed to be little bullets. All living things are made of cells. Cells maintain internal balance, which is this idea of homeostasis. It's going to respond to the environment, growth and development, all these type of things. But the one that we're really going to kind of focus in and explain is all living things use energy. And energy is really the ability to do work. And I'm not just talking about, hey, go out 9 to 5 work type of thing. Talking about all the work that your cells do as far as, we talked about this facilitated diffusion and needing energy and thinking about your body repairing itself and creating proteins and genetic codes and all of the reproductive stuff. So energy, lots of energy. So how do we get that energy, or where does it come from? So remember back to our handy dandy little energy pyramid. Again, I said a lot of this first stuff is really review. So remember, we have our primary producers on the bottom. They're also called our autotrophs. Remember them? Those are the individuals, those plants and some other types of organisms that are able to use light energy from the sun to produce their food. And then as you move up the chain, you get into heterotrophs. And again, we had different names for all of these different levels and whatnot, but just reminding you that heterotrophs are the ones that are going to have to eat and digest the primary producers or other heterotrophs in order to obtain their energy. So the heterotrophs cannot create their own. They're not going to use the sun. They have to eat other organisms. So we know that some energy can be, we can get energy from the sun. But that doesn't really explain how maybe we as humans get our energy, because we're not going to absorb the sun and magically get energy. And just a reminder, there's lots of different, energy comes in a lot of different forms. So we got light, which the autotrophs use, heat, electricity, and this is kind of the big one for us, is this idea of chemical reactions. This would be what we consider a potential energy source. Light, heat, electricity, those are kinetic energy sources, so those are based off of kind of movement, the movement of molecules. When we look at chemical reactions, we're looking at, okay, what energy is stored in the bond. So we think of our little water here, our little water molecule. So it is bonded together, and there is energy stored, in a sense, in these bonds. So when we break these bonds or we form different bonds, there's this kind of transfer of energy. And that's what we're going to talk about, kind of how we get our sources of energy. We can't get it from the sun, so has to be some type of chemical reactions that are occurring that are going to give us our energy. Again, so we are the ones that there need to be some type of conversion between this light, possibly, or other energy forms into something we can use. Chemical reactions take place in organisms that convert the above energy forms along with food and other chemicals into usable energy, which is often in the form of sugars, and carbohydrates. We're going to kind of talk about that. So there's this big idea of metabolism, and metabolism is the total of all chemical reactions an organism needs to survive. Kind of in some other words, it's also the combination of chemical reactions through which an organism builds up or breaks down materials as it carries out life processes. Again, there's going to be kind of this building up as we create certain things and then breaking it down, because chemical reactions, we know by the breaking and creating of bonds, is going to have energy involved. There are thousands of chemical reactions that make up metabolism. Specifically, what we're going to focus on is photosynthesis and cellular respiration, kind of in this chapter and the next chapter. So we're going to focus on photosynthesis now and cellular respiration in chapter 9. All right, so what form is energy stored kind of within our bodies or within our cells? And so we know that plants somehow are going to use the energy from the sun to produce their own energy, their own food, but how is that stored? And then how do we, as heterotrophs, get that energy as well? So really, for our sense, the food that we eat is used to make ATP. So within the digestive system and in the lysosomes, remember our lysosomes, they're going to kind of clean up, do some of that breakdown. There's a bunch of different chemical reactions that are going on that are going to break down the materials that we get from the plants and other organisms. And that's going to be broken down and then put into the mitochondria. Remember, our mitochondria is the powerhouse for our cell, that type of thing. Plants, they're going to get energy from the sun, and you're going to kind of sprinkle in a few other things, carbon dioxide, water, to create these glucose molecules. And what are those kind of then used for is we get this molecule of ATP. Okay. The main chemical compound that cells use to store and release energy is this ATP. Adenosine triphosphate is its long name. You're going to hear us call it primarily ATP. And again, through chemical reactions in both plants, autotrophs, heterotrophs, they are going to create this ATP because it's great for storing and also kind of releasing energy. Cells use the ATP for all their basic cell processes. So when we think about things like cell division, replication of chromosomes, remember the facilitated or the active transport that was requiring some energy, movement of the cells, repairing of tissues, like all of that stuff. Think of all the things that cells do to live, the characteristics of life, and they are going to use this ATP for it. So how does this really work? Let's move on to the next slide to kind of find out. Again, let's take a look at what this bad boy looks like. It consists of adenine, there's this guy here, and a 5-carbon sugar called ribose, and 3 phosphate groups. So this is our little ribose here, and then we got our phosphate groups here. And the phosphate groups are the key to its ability to store and release energy. And again, remember this one is 3. We have triphosphate. All right, so we said the phosphate groups are really the key to this storage and production of energy. So how does it do that? Well, ATP basically turns into ADP, adenosine diphosphate, and it's basically missing the phosphate molecule. The thing here is it cannot store as much energy, and you want to think of it as a half-charge battery. So what happens is you have, you have this ATP molecule, which really has the 3 phosphate groups on there, and it's going to turn into ADP. And during this process, you're going to get this releasing of energy. And that's because that phosphate bond that's bonded to another phosphate group is going to break, and you're going to get this release of energy. So you end up with ADP. And so you can kind of think of ADP as a half-charged battery. It doesn't have as much energy as its counterpart, ATP. ATP is really the fully charged one. It's going to store energy, and then when we need that energy, we're going to break that bond and then create ADP and energy. So the next slide shows a better graphic of this. All right, so we think of our ADP versus ATP. Again, this is talking about the storage of energy within the cells. And so you have this chemical, ATP or ADP, with the ability to form and break bonds that are going to release energy. So what happens is we have this ATP if there's production of ATP, which we'll talk about when we get more into photosynthesis. That is our happy, lots of energy, fully charged energy molecule. And it can, and I'm going to show the arrow going this way as well, we can break this little bond here and release some of that energy. So energy may be released, and then we get ADP, which is like a partially charged battery. It doesn't have as much energy in it. However, we can give it a little bit more energy, and it can add that phosphate group back on and become fully charged. So ATP, ADP is one of the storage molecules, stores energy, and also kind of produces energy in the sense of when it breaks those bonds. That's why cells are going to use it, and we're going to talk more about how is that ATP actually produced. But the point of this little section is the idea that there's energy out there. Energy coming from the sun, which are going to help autotrophs, and then the heterotrophs have to figure out a way to get energy as well, so they are going to eat heterotrophs or each other and do some metabolism and whatnot. But regardless of whether it's an autotroph or it can produce its own or it's a heterotroph, there's going to be these chemical reactions that are going on that are going to help transfer or convert different types of energy into energy the cell can use in its everyday life processes. So you might be asking yourself, oh, so are cells just full of ATP or its partner ADP? Well, not exactly. While ATP is often used for storage and the creation or the release of energy, it's not necessarily the most efficient molecule for energy storage. In fact, if we look at sugar glucose, that will store 90 times the amount of chemical energy than a molecule of ATP. So really, cells are only going to contain a small amount of ATP, just about enough for a couple of seconds of activity in their cells, because there are other molecules that are going to be better storage kind of containers, as we would say, for energy. This ends the notes for section 8.1.